Right before I left for an out-of-town work trip, my husband suddenly came up to me and said, "I'm worried your brakes aren't right. I don't want anything to happen to you on the highway." He insisted on checking my car himself. After he was done and I finally got on the road, something felt off. A strange, rhythmic ticking came from the back of the car, so I pulled over and checked the tire. That's when I saw it. A small black device tucked inside the wheel well. Suspicious, I quietly took it to the police. 2 hours later, they called me back, the officer's voice shaking. What they told me, and what they showed me, made my lungs freeze. I never imagined. Before I tell you exactly what they found, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so I can keep bringing you more stories like this one. Because what happened next turned my whole life into a crime thriller I never asked for. That morning had started like any other. I was up before sunrise, ironing my work clothes, packing my laptop and files for a big presentation in another city. I'm a pretty independent woman, used to handling my own career in my own car, and I'd driven that route a dozen times. My husband, Mark, sat at the kitchen table in front of a cup of untouched coffee, tapping his fingers on the wood. Normally, he greets me with a smile and a joke. That day, he was pale, sweating, and staring through the wall like his mind was somewhere else entirely. When I touched his shoulder and asked if he was feeling sick, he flinched like I'd shocked him. Then he forced a smile and said he'd just had a horrible dream. In it, my car's brakes failed on the highway and I died in a terrible crash. He sounded so sincere, so shaken that I felt guilty for even doubting him. He jumped up, saying he had a bad feeling and needed to check my car himself, especially the rear brakes. I handed him my keys without a second thought. He disappeared into the garage while I rechecked my work documents, feeling oddly loved and protected. From the living room window, I watched him open the doors, sit inside for a moment, then crouch by the back wheel, almost disappearing under the car. I saw his hands working on something I couldn't see, his shoulders tense. I thought, wow, I'm so lucky to have a husband this careful. 15 minutes later, he came back in, hands smudged with grease and shaking just a little. He told me there really had been a loose bolt in the rear brake assembly that if he hadn't tightened it, a long, fast drive could have been disastrous. I don't know anything about engines, so I believed every word and hugged him, thanking him for saving me. Before I left, I called my mom, Grace, like I always do on long trips. She prayed for me on speakerphone, told me not to speed and to keep saying little prayers under my breath as I drove. Her voice calmed me the way it always does. When I hung up, Mark was standing in the garage doorway watching me intently. I started the engine. It sounded normal. He leaned in, kissed my forehead for a long time and told me to be careful. Only later did I realize his eyes weren't warm at all. They were cold, calculating, like a predator, letting its prey walk into a trap. The roads were clear that morning, the kind of quiet highway that makes you want to turn up the radio and zone out. I tried to focus on my presentation, rehearsing slides in my head. For a while, everything seemed fine. The steering felt solid. The brakes worked smoothly at the toll gate. The engine was steady. But that strange ticking sound started, faint at first, like small stones hitting metal. Except the rhythm was too regular. Tick, tick, tick. The more I drove, the more it burrowed into my nerves until I turned off the music just to listen. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid because of Mark's nightmare story. But the sound stayed, stubborn, always coming from the same place, somewhere behind me. Finally, I saw a wide shoulder on the side of the road and decided not to risk it. I signaled, slowed down, and pulled over. My heart was beating fast for no clear reason, just that prickling instinct that every woman knows. With my phone's flashlight on, I walked around the car in the wind of passing trucks and crouched by the rear wheel, the one Mark had been so obsessed with. At first I saw nothing but dirt and the usual tangle of metal and rubber. Then, tucked inside the frame near the fuel tank, I saw a little black box, about the size of a pack of cigarettes, stuck there as if it belonged. It was too clean, too new compared to the dusty metal around it. When I leaned closer, my stomach dropped. There was a tiny red LED on its side, blinking steadily. Beep, beep. I didn't understand what it was, but I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. My hands shook as I tugged it free. It came loose with a hard pull, held in place by a strong magnet and a few thin wires that snapped when I yanked. Sitting there on the side of the highway with that cold little box in my palm, 1,000 questions exploded in my mind. What was this? A tracker? A bomb? Some kind of sabotage? Who had put it there? The last person under my car that morning was Mark, the man who had saved my life. I felt sick. For a second, I thought about calling him, asking for an explanation. But my gut screamed no. If he had done something terrible, calling him would only tell him I'd discovered it. I got back in the car, placed the box on the passenger seat as far from me as possible, and turned the car around, heading not toward my meeting but toward the nearest police station. When I pulled into the precinct's front lot, I didn't even park straight. I jumped out, clutching the box to my chest, and ran to the front desk. The officer on duty, later I'd learn his name was Ethan, saw my face and immediately took me seriously. I told him, as calmly as I could, that I'd found this device under my car, that my husband was the last one to touch it, and that I had a very bad feeling. He took the box gingerly, eyes narrowing, and called someone on his radio. Within seconds, another officer appeared with a plastic evidence container and carried the device away, leaving me with nothing but my pounding heartbeat and a paper cup of warm water. They put me in a small waiting room, white walls, hard chair, buzzing fluorescent light that made everything feel cold and unreal. At first, the officers were polite but casual, asking me basic questions, probably thinking it was a GPS tracker from some jealous husband. But as the minutes ticked by, I saw their expressions change through the glass window. The guy who had taken the box came back looking pale. There was a lot of whispered talking, then someone picked up a phone with a red label on it. I heard the words "bomb squad" and "evacuate." My blood turned to ice. They asked me to switch off my phone and stay inside the room. Even when I needed the bathroom, a female officer walked me there and back like I was under protection. Or suspicion. After what felt like years but was really only about 2 hours, the door opened and Officer Ethan came in holding a special police phone. His face was tight, serious in a way that made me want to throw up. He said his superior wanted to talk to me from the bomb squad area where they had moved the device. I pressed the receiver to my ear and heard heavy breathing, then a steady male voice that barely concealed his shock. He introduced himself as Captain Harris, head of the team. He told me to stay calm, then said something that shattered the world I thought I lived in. The box under my car wasn't just a tracker. It was a remote detonator wired to a small but incredibly powerful charge of plastic explosive attached near my fuel tank. He explained that inside that little box was enough explosive to rip open the gas tank and turn my car into a fireball in seconds. The design was sophisticated with a double triggering system. First, a motion and speed sensor. If my car stayed above a certain speed on the highway for long enough, the device would automatically arm itself and be ready to detonate. Second, a remote option. Someone watching my location signal from afar could choose the exact moment to trigger it via cellular signal. In other words, if I had just kept driving like normal, I would have died in what looked like a random mechanical accident, burned beyond recognition. My husband's nightmare would have come true, because he planned it. I couldn't even answer him at first. Tears just started streaming down my face without sound. All the little moments from that morning replayed in my head. Mark's trembling hands, his obsessive brake check, the way he watched me leave as if he were memorizing his last look at me. I felt stupid for not seeing it, guilty for ever trusting him, and yet a tiny part of me still wanted to deny it. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe. But then Captain Harris said something else that killed the last of my illusions. The device was broadcasting my location. Whoever had planted it knew exactly where I'd stopped on the highway, and they would certainly notice that the signal was now inside a police station. That was the moment the story stopped being just about me surviving and started being about catching a murderer. Captain Harris told me bluntly that if my husband really was behind this, he might try to run, destroy evidence, or even hurt someone else once he realized I'd gone to the police. They needed time to investigate, to search our house and his devices, to build a solid case. The fastest way to buy that time, he said, was to let my husband believe his plan had worked. We would have to trick the trickster. We would fake my death. The plan sounded like something out of a movie, but there was no other safe option. The bomb squad would carefully disconnect the explosive, place it in a shock-proof container, and mount the tracker on a decoy vehicle. That car would leave the station and follow the exact route I was supposed to take, at my usual speed, straight out onto the highway, and then to an abandoned quarry miles away, far from any homes. There, the bomb would be detonated in a controlled blast, designed to mimic a catastrophic crash and fire. Meanwhile, the police media team would prepare a short statement about a tragic accident, and local news would report that a woman driving a car just like mine had died when her brakes failed and the vehicle exploded. I listened, numb, as they laid it all out in front of me like a script. At any other time, I might have laughed at how insane it sounded. But my husband had put a bomb under my car. Reality had already gone insane. Slowly, my fear turned into something harder, sharper. Rage, hurt, betrayal. 5 years of marriage suddenly looked like the prettiest mask hell had ever painted. I wiped my tears and told Captain Harris I would do whatever it took. I wasn't going to be a victim waiting quietly in a corner. If Mark wanted me dead for reasons I still didn't understand, then he was going to look me in the eye when his whole plan collapsed on his head. They moved me to a secure room with a large monitor showing a map. On it, a red dot, my car, left the police station and merged onto the highway. It moved just like I would have, keeping a moderate speed, tracing the route I'd driven countless times before. Somewhere out there, Mark was almost certainly watching the same dot on his phone or laptop, waiting for the moment it stopped. My hands clenched as I watched the decoy turn off toward the quarry. When the dot reached the marked point, it flickered, stuttered, then vanished as the bomb squad triggered the device. No sound reached us, but Captain Harris told me softly, "That was your accident." Almost immediately after the signal disappeared, my real phone, back on but in silent mode, vibrated on the table. Every officer in the room turned to look at it. The name on the screen was Mark. My hand shook as I opened his message. "Hey, love. Where are you now? I have the worst feeling. Please text me as soon as you arrive. I'm so worried about you." If I hadn't known the truth, I might have cried from gratitude. But reading it right after the fake explosion dot vanished, with the bomb squad report still ringing in my ears, I could see the real meaning. He wasn't worried. He was checking whether I was finally dead. While another team secured the house and began quietly digging into Mark's life, Captain Harris brought me into an office and set a thick red folder on the desk. He looked older than he had that morning. Inside, he said, was part of the answer to why my husband would go this far. The police had accessed Mark's office safe and recovered documents from his laptop, including a formal letter from a law firm that I had never seen. It was addressed to me but signed as received 3 weeks earlier, with Mark's signature. The letter informed Mrs. Emily Carter that her biological father, a businessman I hadn't seen since I was a toddler, had died recently and left behind a vast agricultural and real estate fortune. I had grown up believing my father had either died long ago or simply never cared. In reality, he'd built a small empire of farmland, properties, and investments worth tens of millions of dollars. The will, notarized and airtight, named me as his sole heir. But there was a clause. If I died before the inheritance was fully transferred and I had no children, my legal spouse would become the substitute heir. Our 5-year marriage had never produced kids. Mark had intercepted the letter, hidden my father's death from me, and read that clause before I even knew any of it existed. I stared at the signature line on the receipt. His handwriting. The motive suddenly burned bright and ugly. Greed. It got worse. The digital forensics team had unearthed messages between Mark and a woman named Chloe, a former paralegal from a notary office. She wasn't just his mistress, she was his accomplice. In their chats, she coached him on how to quietly prepare paperwork and fake certain documents so that, once I was tragically killed in an accident, he could slide into my place with minimal questions and claim everything. My heart broke all over again, but this time the pain came with clarity. It wasn't that he'd stopped loving me. It was that he had never loved me as much as he loved the idea of easy money. I told Captain Harris I didn't just want Mark arrested. I wanted him to feel his world crumble like he tried to crumble mine. The first step was gathering undeniable proof and breaking him psychologically so he wouldn't have the strength or time to spin another lie. While I remained hidden at the station, the police installed covert cameras and microphones in my house, piggybacking on the smart home system Mark himself had set up. That same evening, after the news of my accident hit local TV and social media, our street filled with neighbors bringing condolences. Watching on the monitor, I saw Mark standing in the doorway in a white shirt, trembling, wiping dry eyes with a handkerchief, playing the devastated widower so well that even I might have believed him. When the neighbors left and the front door closed, his entire body language changed. His shoulders straightened. The tears vanished like they'd never been there. He walked to the kitchen with a spring in his step, opened the fridge, and pulled out expensive steak and imported drinks he had clearly hidden for this moment. A few minutes later, the back door opened and Chloe stepped in, stylish and smiling. She kissed him and asked, "So, did it work?" He laughed and said, "Clean. Everyone thinks it was a brake failure. Tomorrow I'll start the paperwork. In a month, we'll be millionaires." Watching them cook and toast in my kitchen, sitting in my chair talking about how they'd redecorate my home and ship my mother off to a nursing facility, filled me with a cold fury I can't describe. Every disgusting word was recorded, Mark mocking me as boring and too straight, Chloe joking about how online comments were praying for the poor widower while he chewed on perfect medium-rare steak. If you're still watching at this point, tell me in the comments what you would have done seeing your husband celebrate your death like that. Would you want him arrested right away, or would you, like me, prefer to let him feel the breath of a ghost on his neck first? Because that's exactly what we did next. Captain Harris suggested that before we slammed the cell door, we let his own guilt and fear soften him up. I agreed without hesitation. Mark is the kind of man who believes in nothing he can't see. So we decided to give him something he could see, inside his own smart home. On the third night after my death, there was a memorial gathering at the house. Neighbors filled the living room, reciting prayers, murmuring condolences, while my mother sat in a corner, genuinely devastated. Mark sat front and center, playing his grieving role. That was when the lights began to flicker, not randomly, but in an odd pattern, bright, dim, off, blinding, then a cold, low glow. The air conditioning suddenly blasted freezing air, making curtains billow and people shiver. Guests whispered about bad wiring, but Mark's eyes darted to his phone. He knew the system was digital and recently upgraded. When he checked the app to adjust the settings, he got an error message. Access denied. Primary administrator, Emily. He had supposedly removed me from the system. His skin went gray. Before anyone could react, the smart speaker on the sideboard lit up, spinning its blue ring, and started playing a familiar voice. My voice, singing a silly song I used to hum in the shower, then laughing and saying, "Honey, don't forget to lock the door." People gasped. My mother sobbed aloud. Mark lunged for the speaker, ripped the cable from the wall, and tripped over the rug, crashing to the floor in front of everyone. He stammered some excuse about glitches, but his hands were shaking and the neighbors' eyes were wide with unease. It looked and felt like a haunting. The final blow that night came after most guests had drifted home, taking their unease with them. A delivery rider in a plain dark jacket walked up to the gate with a small, stained cardboard box. He rang the bell and handed it to Mark. "Express delivery for Mr. Mark Carter," he said, and left before Mark could ask anything. There was no sender's name, only a message scrawled on the lid. "For my beloved husband." Mark opened it in the hallway, watched live by the police and by me on the screen. Inside was a cracked, burned brake disc and an old wrench splattered with thick red liquid that looked like blood, but was only oil and paint. On top lay a piece of paper in my handwriting. "You forgot to tighten one bolt in your heart. I've come home to fix it." Mark screamed and flung the box away, metal clattering across the floor. He backed into the wall, eyes wild, scanning every shadow as if I might be standing there, smoking from the wreck of my car. That night, he didn't sleep in our bedroom. He locked himself in the guest room with all the lights on, clutching a kitchen knife. We tried calling Chloe's phone from the station just to see, but by then she was already in custody and her number went straight to voicemail. Mark was alone, with his guilt, his greed, and the ghost he thought he'd created. By the time the day came for him to collect his inheritance, his nerves were frayed, but his greed, as we predicted, was stronger than his fear. On the morning of the signing, Mark put on his best suit and slicked back his hair, trying to look like the respectable businessman he'd always wanted to be. Security cameras in the law firm's lobby showed him walking in with his chin high, taking in the marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows like he already owned them. He was escorted into a luxurious conference room where an older attorney and a notary sat waiting with a stack of papers. They greeted him politely and began reading out the details of my father's estate. Farmland, commercial buildings, investment accounts, all adding up to a number that made even the officers watching the feed whistle under their breath. Finally, the attorney slid the main document across the table along with a gold pen. He calmly explained that, in light of my death and the clear wording of the will, Mark would become the sole beneficiary, provided he signed the acceptance and all related forms. Mark's hand trembled, but this time from excitement. He glanced quickly at the text without really reading it. He'd already done that weeks ago with Chloe's help. As the pen hovered over the signature line, the attorney placed his hand lightly on the paper and said, "Just one moment, Mr. Carter. Our procedures require a final verification by a key witness, especially in cases involving a sudden suspicious death. We wouldn't want any disputes later." Mark frowned in irritation. "What witness? My wife is gone. There's no one else," he snapped. The attorney didn't answer. He simply looked toward the heavy double doors at the end of the room. Following his gaze, Mark turned too. Behind the mirrored glass where I was watching with Captain Harris, I felt my own heart speed up. Slowly, the handles turned and the doors swung inward. Heels clicked on the marble floor, sharp, measured, calm. I stepped into the room wearing a simple dark blazer and trousers, hair pulled back, makeup minimal. No injuries, no burns, very much alive. Mark's mouth fell open. The pen slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a tiny final sound. For a few seconds he just stared at me, his face draining of color. "No," he whispered. "No, you're dead. I saw the news. I saw the car." He backed up until he hit the filing cabinet, hands pawing at the air like he could push the hallucination away. I walked up to the table, glanced down at the inheritance papers he'd been about to sign, and shoved them aside with one finger as if they were trash. Then I looked straight into his eyes and said as calmly as I could, "Hi, Mark. Surprise. I did make it to my destination yesterday. I just forgot to die." His legs buckled and he slid down the cabinet, staring up at me like I was the real ghost now. That was the cue. The doors behind me opened again, and Captain Harris entered in full uniform, flanked by officers and by Ethan carrying a laptop. Mark tried to scramble to his feet, shouting that this was illegal, that I had faked my death to steal his money. He claimed it was all a setup. Harris didn't even raise his voice. He set the laptop on the table, pressed play, and Mark's own living room filled the screen. There he was, laughing with Chloe, clinking glasses over steak, boasting that he didn't care whether I died instantly or burned slowly, as long as I disappeared and my signature was no longer needed. Every word echoed horribly in the polished conference room. Mark stared at the recording as if seeing a stranger, then began babbling denials no one believed. A moment later, the door opened again and Chloe was marched in, wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. Whatever loyalty she'd had evaporated once she faced prison time. She pointed at Mark and told the officers that the bomb, the break story, the fake documents, everything had been his idea, that she'd only helped tweak the paperwork. I didn't care which of them had come up with which part of the plan. They had planned to burn me alive for money. Harris recited the charges calmly: attempted murder, conspiracy, use of explosives, fraud. An officer pulled Mark's hands behind his back and snapped cold metal around his wrists. As they led him past me, he tried one last time, calling me baby, begging me to listen. I didn't move. I just held his gaze until he looked away first. Outside, the press was already waiting. Cameras flashed as Mark and Chloe were led into police cars. The story had shifted. I was no longer the faceless victim of a tragic accident, but the survivor of a murder plot and the key witness who had helped bring the criminals down. From the window upstairs, I watched Mark duck his head against the cameras, his dreams of easy wealth stripped away in front of the whole city. I exhaled a breath I felt like I'd been holding since the moment I heard that first ticking sound under my car. Justice hadn't erased the pain, but it felt like closing a door on a burning room and finally stepping outside. 6 months later, the trial was over. The evidence was overwhelming. The bomb itself, the GPS data, the recordings from the house, the intercepted messages. Mark's defense tried to argue he was mentally unstable, but the careful planning showed otherwise. The judge gave him the maximum, life in prison, with terrorism and attempted murder on his record. Chloe received a long sentence too, though shorter than his. In the high-security wing where he ended up, Mark went from suits and steaks to concrete walls and a thin mattress. Food was bland, the air damp, always smelling faintly of bleach and despair. With nothing to distract him, Mark had endless hours to replay his lost fortune in his mind until it ate him alive from the inside. One afternoon, I got a call from the prison saying Mark had requested a visit. I thought about it for a long minute, then agreed. I didn't go there to forgive him. I went to lock the last door in my mind. When I sat down on the visitor's side of the glass, I barely recognized him. His hair was shaved, his face gaunt, eyes ringed with dark circles. He grabbed the phone with shaking hands, staring at me like I was both a lifeline and a nightmare. I told him calmly that the divorce was final, that my mother and I were safe, and that I was rebuilding my life. He listened in silence, then leaned forward when I said there was one last thing about the inheritance he didn't know. Greed never dies easily. Even there, in that gray jumpsuit, his eyes lit up at the word inheritance. I let him hope for a second, then told him that my father's company, the one he'd tried to kill me for, had actually collapsed under mismanagement years before. The will listed impressive assets, yes, but the debts and tax claims attached to them were even larger. If your plan had worked, I said softly, you would have inherited not millions but hundreds of millions in debt. You'd have spent your life running from collectors instead of sitting here. His face contorted, then went blank. He shook his head violently, shouting that I was lying. I smiled faintly and stood up, putting the phone back on the hook. Whether he believed me or not didn't really matter. In his mind, I had just transformed his grand prize into a lifetime of imaginary debt. The truth? The businesses were battered but salvageable. With good lawyers and some negotiations, the estate turned into a very real, very comfortable fortune in my name alone. Mark will never know that. Let him rot, believing he ruined his life for nothing at all. That's a prison inside his prison, and he built it himself. Outside those walls, my world looks very different now. I bought a small house in the hills for my mom and me, far from the street where my neighbors once whispered about my accident. I've started learning how to manage the farms and properties my father left, and I'm setting up a foundation to help women escape abusive or dangerous relationships before they end up like I almost did. Sometimes when I'm driving my new car up into the green, quiet countryside, I think about that first ticking sound and the cold little box in my hand. I roll the window down, let the wind hit my face, and remember how close I came to disappearing without anyone ever knowing the truth. Not anymore. The brakes of my life are in my own hands now, and I decide when to slow down and when to move on. If this story shook you even a little, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. Out there, someone might be sitting across from a smiling monster and calling him husband the way I once did, and she needs to know it's not paranoia to listen when something deep inside you whispers, pull over and check the wheel.